An envelope arrived, heavy not with paper, but with shadows. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Comment below where you're watching from. I love reading your messages. The mystery unfolds now. The hedges were trimmed with moral determination, the roses bloomed with punctual obedience, and even the gossip moved in polite, predictable circles. Never too fast, never too cruel. It was the sort of village where tragedies belonged to newspapers and scandal occurred elsewhere. That Saturday afternoon, the village gathered in the gardens of Hawthorne Lodge for Mrs. Dalrymple's annual summer fete. The bunting hung in cheerful loops from oak to oak. A string quartet attempted something ambitious beneath a sycamore tree, and tables sagged modestly under the weight of sponge cakes and cucumber sandwiches, till Miss Marple sat slightly apart from the densest cluster of guests, her knitting needles clicking softly. She wore a pale lavender hat that trembled faintly whenever she inclined her head, which she did often, for she listened far more than she spoke. From her wicker chair, she observed. Young Clara Whitfield laughed a little too brightly at Mr. Edmund Fallow's remarks. Colonel Armitage kept checking his pocket watch, though there was nowhere else he intended to be. Mrs. Price dabbed at her upper lip with unnecessary frequency. Human nature, Miss Marple often reflected, was much like knitting. Patterns emerged if one only paid attention to the tension of the thread. At precisely 3 o'clock, Mrs. Dalrymple clapped her hands. Now then, before we cut the cake, I have something rather unusual to announce. There was an immediate hush, broken only by the distant cooing of pigeons and the faint clink of china. Mrs. Dalrymple, stout and flushed with the pleasure of hosting, held aloft a cream-colored envelope. It was thick, expensive paper, sealed with dark crimson wax, bearing no crest anyone recognized. It arrived this morning, she said, smiling uncertainly. Addressed simply to the residents of St. Renford. A ripple of mild amusement passed through the crowd. How theatrical, murmured Mr. Fallow. Miss Marple's needles paused. Mrs. Dalrymple cleared her throat and broke the seal. The crack of wax sounded oddly sharp in the warm air. She unfolded the single sheet inside and began to read aloud. Before the sun sets twice more, one among you shall pay for what was done. The past is not buried, it waits. Ask yourselves which of you carries shadows. Silence followed, and a swallow darted across the lawn. Someone gave a nervous laugh, too quickly. Good heavens, exclaimed Mrs. Price. What dreadful nonsense. Colonel Armitage stepped forward. Surely some childish prank. Indeed, said Mr. Fallow smoothly. Village theatrics. Mrs. Dalrymple attempted a chuckle, though it trembled at the edges. Well, we shall not let anonymous melodrama spoil the sponge cake. Conversation resumed, though it had shifted subtly. Voices were lower, glances sharper. Small knots of guests formed and reformed. The string quartet faltered before valiantly recovering. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Beside her, Reverend Collingwood lowered himself into a neighboring chair. Distasteful humor, he muttered. One wonders who would indulge in such unpleasantness. Yes, said Miss Marple mildly, as one does. Her pale blue eyes drifted over the lawn. Clara Whitfield had gone pale. Edmund Fallow was smiling still, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Mrs. Price had withdrawn entirely toward the refreshment table, whispering fiercely to her husband. The colonel stood very straight, his jaw set. The past is not buried. It waits. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the past seldom required encouragement to resurface. It possessed a curious instinct for timing. People dislike reminders, she added softly, particularly when they believe themselves safe. Reverend Collingwood glanced at her. You don't suppose there's anything to it? Miss Marple's needles clicked twice more before she answered. My dear Reverend, anonymous letters are rather like thistledown. They may appear light and foolish, but they originate from something quite solid. Across the lawn, young Thomas Price stooped to retrieve a discarded fragment of crimson wax from the grass. He examined it briefly, then dropped it again when he realized he was being watched. Miss Marple noticed. The cake was cut. Tea was poured. Laughter returned in uneven bursts. Yet beneath the merriment lay something altered, like a seam pulled too tight beneath fabric. By 4:30, the fete began to disperse. Guests departed in clusters, conversations clipped short, expressions guarded. The envelope lay forgotten on the lace tablecloth. Forgotten by most. Not by Miss Marple. She rose with careful deliberation and made her way toward the table as Mrs. Dalrymple supervised the clearing away of teacups. "Such a shame about that little disturbance," Mrs. Dalrymple said. "It quite unsettled everyone." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed gently. "May I?" She gestured toward the letter. "Oh, of course, though I assure you it is merely foolishness." Miss Marple examined the paper. High-quality stock. Expensive. Not village shop material. The ink had bled faintly at one corner, as though the writer's hand had lingered. "Curious," she murmured. "What is?" "Only that whoever wrote this wished very much to be taken seriously." Mrs. Dalrymple shivered despite the warmth. As Miss Marple returned the letter to its envelope, she noticed something else, almost imperceptible, a faint smudge along the inner fold. Not ink. Ash. She tucked the observation away, much as she did her knitting when a pattern became complicated. At 6 o'clock, and the sun dipped low behind Hawthorne Lodge. At 7, the first police carriage arrived, and at dusk, as swallows skimmed the quiet rooftops of St. Renford, the body of Edmund Fallow was discovered in his study, collapsed beside his writing desk, a thin ribbon of smoke still curling upward from the grate in his fireplace. On his desk lay a single sheet of paper, blank, but faintly dusted with ash. The past, it seemed, had indeed begun to stir. Miss Marple, informed just before supper, folded her hands in her lap. "How very unfortunate," she said softly. Yet her eyes held not surprise, but recognition. The news traveled with the speed of a dropped teacup. By the time the constable's bicycle lamp bobbed along the lane toward Hawthorne Lodge, half the village was already standing in doorways in dressing gowns, calling quietly across hedges, peering from behind curtains that twitched as if afflicted with a nervous disorder. Edmund Fallow, so polished at the fete, so calmly amused by the anonymous warning, was dead in his study. The words in the envelope returned at once to every mind, now no longer theatrical nonsense, but something colder, something that sat in the stomach. At Hawthorne Lodge, the air had that peculiar, heavy stillness that settles after a shock, like dust after a carpet has been beaten. Mrs. Dalrymple had been shepherded into the drawing-room with a glass of brandy she kept attempting to refuse on principle, though her hands shook too much to manage it. The servants hovered, whispering and watching one another, as if a murderer might step out from behind the curtains at any moment and ask for more sugar. Miss Marple arrived quietly, shawl pinned at her throat, her expression mild. She had walked rather than sent for a car. Walking gave one time to think and to listen. In the lane she had already heard 3 versions of what had happened, each embellished by the teller's imagination and each far more interested in moral conclusions than facts. In the hall she found Colonel Armitage standing stiffly near the hat stand, his face set into military lines that suggested discipline could be applied to death with sufficient firmness. "They've sent a man from Market Basing," he said when he saw her. His voice was low, as though to speak louder might disturb the body upstairs. "Inspector, name of Slack." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "How sensible." Colonel Armitage looked at her sharply, as though uncertain whether she was being ironic. Miss Marple was seldom ironic. That was, in itself, unsettling. The inspector arrived with brisk competence, accompanied by a local constable who seemed anxious to be everywhere at once and therefore achieved being nowhere useful. Inspector Slack was a broad man with eyes that missed little and lips that approved even less. He had the manner of someone who disliked village mysteries because they came wrapped in lace and lies. He spoke briefly with Mrs. Dalrymple, then climbed the stairs without ceremony. Upstairs, Edmund Fallow's study held itself with a kind of offended dignity. Books lined the walls, handsome volumes that had never been opened often enough to crease. A decanter sat on a sideboard, the stopper still in place. The desk was tidy except for the blank sheet of paper and the faint scatter of ash that had settled across it as delicately as flour. Edmund Fallow lay near the desk and partly turned as if he had risen, and then reconsidered. His face had that strange calmness death sometimes grants, smoothing away the expressive habits of the living. The doctor, who had been called from the next village, a plump man in a rumpled coat, knelt beside him and muttered professional noises, then straightened. "Dead several hours," he said. "No obvious wound. Could be poison. Could be heart, but—" His gaze flicked toward the fireplace where something had been burned recently. "That would be a very tidy coincidence." Inspector Slack grunted, as though he had never trusted coincidences in his life. "There was smoke still," the maid whispered from the doorway. "When I went to lay out the evening tray, sir, a little curl of it, and the smell. Like paper." Slack's eyes moved to the grate. There were remnants there, charred fragments, grey and delicate. He crouched and prodded them with a pencil. "Paper," he said, "and something thicker, card, perhaps." Downstairs, the atmosphere in the drawing-room had curdled into a mixture of indignation and fear. People were arriving, not invited now, but drawn by the instinct that tragedy was a kind of entertainment, provided it happened to someone else. Clara Whitfield had come with her mother, Mrs. Whitfield, a narrow, upright woman who looked as if she had been carved from disapproval. Clara's eyes were too wide, her hands clasped too tightly. Thomas Price arrived with his wife, Mrs. Price still fluttering her handkerchief as though it were a flag of personal innocence. Reverend Collingwood came, pale and flustered. Colonel Armitage remained. Mrs. Dalrymple sat like an overturned teapot. Stout, steaming, Susan incapable of righting herself. Inspector Slack descended and surveyed them as if they were a row of goods at market. "Right," he said. "We'll do this simply. Mr. Fallow was at your garden affair this afternoon. Then he came home. Someone was in that house with him or came after. Someone burned something in his fireplace, and now he's dead. That letter you all heard read, where is it?" Mrs. Dalrymple made a small strangled sound. The envelope. I left it on the table. It was there." "The table isn't a safe," Slack snapped. "Fetch it." A servant hurried out and returned, empty-handed. The lace tablecloth had been cleared away. So had the envelope. "It's gone," the servant said, eyes round. There was a collective intake of breath. That single missing object shifted the room. A letter could be a prank, and a missing letter suggested intent. Mrs. Price's voice rose instantly, pitched for effect. "Well, if that doesn't prove it was someone here. Someone here took it. I said all along it was dreadful, dreadful stirring things up." "Perhaps it blew away," offered Reverend Collingwood weakly, knowing even as he said it how foolish it sounded. Inspector Slack looked unimpressed by Wind as an accomplice. "And who was last near that table?" he demanded. Faces turned instinctively, not toward truth, but toward the most convenient target. Eyes slid toward Thomas Price, who flushed, toward Clara, who went paler, toward Colonel Armitage, who stiffened further, toward Mrs. Dalrymple herself, who looked personally betrayed by her own party. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner, hands folded. She watched the shifting glances, the sudden alliances. the instinctive retreat from any suspicion that might touch oneself. She had seen it in drawing rooms and in village shops, in quiet parlors where people drank tea and in kitchens where they scrubbed pans. Fear always made people both more talkative and less truthful. Inspector Slack began his questions. Where had each person been after the fate dispersed? Had anyone seen Edmund Fallow leave? Had anyone spoken to him? Had anyone been at Hawthorne Lodge before the body was found? Mrs. Whitfield answered sharply that her family had gone straight home. Clara said nothing until prompted, then murmured that she had felt unwell and gone to bed early. Her mother's glance at her was a warning. Thomas Price said he had returned home for supper. His wife supplied the details with excessive eagerness, as if words could build an alibi brick by brick. The Colonel Armitage admitted he had taken a walk. "I often do. Clears the head." "And where did you walk?" Slack asked. "Along the lane, past the vicarage, up toward the common." "Anyone see you?" The Colonel's jaw tightened. "I didn't take attendance." Slack's gaze lingered on him, then moved on. Reverend Collingwood confessed that he had been at the vicarage preparing his Sunday sermon, alone. "Convenient," Slack muttered, making no attempt to soften it. Miss Marple listened to it all with the same mild attention she might have given to an account of an unfortunate jam-making accident. Yet her mind moved swiftly, knitting together small observations into patterns. The envelope was missing. Someone wanted it removed from circulation. Someone wanted to control the story. And in the study, there had been ash. Fine, deliberate, and as if the burning had been done with care, not in panic. The blank sheet on the desk troubled her more than anything. Edmund Fallow had not been the sort of man to keep blank paper on display. He liked everything to look purposeful. Inspector Slack's voice cut through the room again. "We'll search the house," he said. "No one leaves until I say. Constable, keep your eyes open. If someone here thinks they can wander off and tidy up whatever they've done, they've picked the wrong inspector." A soft sound came from near the doorway, a tiny, involuntary noise. Miss Marple saw Clara Whitfield's fingers tighten on her reticule until the clasp bit into her skin. Mrs. Whitfield laid a hand over her daughter's, a gesture that might have been comforting if it hadn't looked so much like restraint. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the fireplace in the drawing-room, where a small arrangement of logs sat ready. Untouched. No ash there. Whatever had been burned upstairs. "Dear, dear," Miss Marple murmured, so softly that no one but Reverend Collingwood, seated nearest her, heard. He glanced at her. "What is it?" Miss Marple's gaze remained gentle, almost absent-minded. "Only that people always imagine they are burning away the past," she said. "But it has such a habit of leaving traces." Upstairs, the inspector's men moved through Edmund Fallow's study, opening drawers, examining waste-baskets, checking the shelves. In the grate, among the ash, the constable found something that did not crumble at the touch. A darkened corner of thicker paper. The edge of it curled and blistered. He carried it down carefully on a saucer, some as if it were a relic. Inspector Slack took it, squinted, and turned it toward the lamp. Faintly, in the blackened fiber, a line of ink remained. Not enough to read a message, but enough to make out a single word, half-burned and stubbornly surviving. "Wren," Slack read aloud, frowning. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. St. Renford, perhaps, or something else entirely. Inspector Slack held the charred fragment nearer to the lamp, tilting it slightly, as though a different angle might persuade the ink to confess more than it wished. "Wren," he repeated. "Could be half of anything." "Renford," Mrs. Price said at once, eager to be useful. "It must mean St. Renford." The letter was addressed to the residents, after all. Slack did not look convinced. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps someone wanted us to think so." He passed the fragment to the constable. "Bag it, carefully." The room felt closer now, as if the air itself were waiting for a mistake. Miss Marple folded her hands more tightly in her lap. Wren, it might indeed refer to the village, but there was something almost deliberate about how the inspector had emphasized it. Half a word, half a truth. People rarely burned documents entirely. They underestimated the persistence of small things. She allowed her gaze to wander again, lightly, as though she were merely observing the wallpaper. Clara Whitfield's pallor had deepened to a faint greenish cast. Thomas Price was whispering urgently to his wife. Colonel Armitage stood as though carved from stone, though a small pulse beat visibly at his temple. Reverend Collingwood appeared to be praying, and Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Right. Until we know more about cause of death, we proceed on the assumption that the letter and Mr. Fallow's demise are connected. Someone wrote that warning. 2 sunsets, it said, and before even one had properly finished. We have a body. Mrs. Dalrymple gave a small moan. You don't suppose it was meant as a warning to him, that he was the one to pay? Or the one to fear, murmured Miss Marple gently. Slack's eyes flicked toward her, measuring. And you are? Miss Marple, she replied with a polite inclination of her head. A resident of the village. I was present when the letter was read. Ah, then you heard the wording. Very distinctly. Slack regarded her for a moment, perhaps deciding whether she would prove troublesome or trivial. Miss Marple's expression suggested neither, till she looked like a harmless elderly lady who might offer cake and confusion in equal measure. Did Mr. Fallow react in any particular way? The inspector asked. There was a hesitation in the room. People disliked admitting that they had watched others too closely. He laughed, Clara said suddenly, her voice thinner than before. He said it was village theatrics. Her mother shot her a warning glance, but Clara continued. But he stopped laughing quickly, only for a second. I noticed. Miss Marple's needles would have paused at that, had she been knitting. Inspector Slack turned sharply. Stopped how? Clara swallowed, as if he'd recognized something, or someone. A murmur rippled through the gathering. Colonel Armitage spoke stiffly. You're imagining things, my dear. A fellow was not a man easily rattled. On the contrary, Miss Marple said softly, and the quiet firmness in her tone stilled the room more effectively than a raised voice. Men who appear unflappable are often the most sensitive to certain reminders. Slack's attention sharpened. Reminders of what? Miss Marple gave a small apologetic smile. Oh, of the past. It is so inconvenient. Silence fell again, but this time it carried weight. Slack drew a slow breath. We'll need to understand Mr. Fallow's history, business dealings, personal connections, any quarrels. Mrs. Price sniffed. He kept to himself mostly, though he did invest in several local ventures, the mill, for instance. Thomas Price shifted uncomfortably at that. The mill? Slack prompted. It was struggling, Mrs. Price continued, unable to stop herself. Mr. Fallow offered capital in exchange for certain adjustments. Thomas shot her a sharp look. That's enough. But the word adjustments hung in the air. Miss Marple watched the interplay with interest. Financial entanglements often bred resentments that took on moral disguises. Money, after all, was rarely just money in a village. It was pride, survival, reputation. Were there any disputes? Slack pressed. Thomas hesitated, then said, business disagreements. Nothing more. Define nothing more. Thomas's jaw tightened. He intended to consolidate, reduce staff, modernize. Some families would have been affected. Displaced, Mrs. Price added unnecessarily. And were you in favor of that? Slack asked. Thomas faltered. I saw both sides. Miss Marple noted the way his wife's hand gripped his sleeve, as if to steady him or restrain him. Upstairs, footsteps crossed the landing. The doctor descended, looking grave. "There's a faint odor," he said. "Bitter almonds." A collective shiver passed through the room. "Poison?" Slack asked. "Possibly. I'll confirm after examination, but it would align with the swift collapse and the burning, perhaps an attempt to destroy whatever message accompanied it." Miss Marple's thoughts quickened. A poisoned man, a burned paper, a blank sheet dusted with ash, and a missing envelope that had threatened retribution. "Inspector," she said gently, "may I ask, was there any sign that Mr. Fallow had written something himself?" Slack frowned. The desk was tidy. Too tidy, perhaps. No drafts, no notes. "And the pen?" "In the stand." "Unused?" He paused. "Dry." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Well, that was interesting. Clara made another small sound. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward her once more. The girl's gaze was fixed not on the inspector, nor on the doctor, but on the charred fragment resting inside its evidence pouch. "Miss Whitfield," Miss Marple said kindly, "did Mr. Fallow ever mention anything to you about the village? About matters unfinished?" Clara's lips parted. Her mother answered before she could. "My daughter had no such conversations." "I didn't," Clara began, then faltered. Inspector Slack seized on it. "Didn't what?" "I didn't think it mattered," she whispered. "He asked me once, only last week, whether I believed people truly forget. I thought it a strange question." "Forget what?" Slack demanded. "He didn't say." Miss Marple felt a small inward tightening of the thread she had been following. And a man asking about memory. A letter invoking the past. A burned paper with Wren surviving. Outside, the evening deepened. The last of the light withdrew from the windows, leaving reflections of anxious faces hovering in the glass. Inspector Slack straightened. "No one leaves the village," he said firmly. "Not until we understand what Mr. Fallow tried to burn and why someone ensured he would never speak again." Miss Marple lowered her gaze, her expression serene. Someone had indeed ensured silence. But silence, she knew, had a curious way of speaking, if one listened carefully enough. The inspector's declaration settled over the room like a drawn curtain. No one leaves the village. In St. Renford, where departures were usually discussed weeks in advance and accompanied by marmalade jars and polite regret, the idea of being confined carried a peculiar sting. Mrs. Dalrymple began to protest faintly about reputations and appearances, but Slack cut her short with a raised hand. "Until we know who sent that letter and what Mr. Fallow burned, everyone remains available for questioning." The doctor departed with solemn efficiency, promising a full report by morning. The body was removed shortly thereafter, the quiet tread of the men on the stairs echoing in a way that seemed indecently loud. Several of the villagers turned their faces away as the stretcher passed. Clara Whitfield did not. She stared at it with a fixed, almost searching expression, as though hoping for some last clarification from the still form beneath the sheet. Miss Marple noticed that too. Gradually, under Slack's watchful eye, the gathering dispersed. His statements would be taken formally the next day, he announced. For now, he advised rest, though it was clear he did not expect anyone to sleep easily. Outside, the night air felt thinner than usual. A small knot of villagers lingered by the gate, whispering. The Prices left quickly, Thomas striding ahead, his wife hurrying to keep pace. Colonel Armitage paused only long enough to offer a stiff nod to Miss Marple before walking into the darkness with military decisiveness. Reverend Collingwood murmured that he would pray for guidance, which sounded less reassuring than he perhaps intended. Clara and her mother remained. "Clara," Mrs. Whitfield said in a low, urgent tone, "you must not involve yourself. You have already said more than necessary." "I only answered what I was asked," Clara replied. There was an edge in her voice that had not been present earlier that afternoon at the fete. Miss Marple approached them with the quiet inevitability of a shadow lengthening at dusk. "My dear," she said gently, addressing Clara, "it is often better to say precisely what one means at the beginning. Silence tends to grow heavier with time." Mrs. Whitfield stiffened. "My daughter has nothing to hide." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Very few people imagine they do." Clara's eyes met Miss Marple's. There was fear there, but also something else. Guilt. No, Miss Marple thought. Not guilt exactly. Conflict. "Mr. Fallow was not kind," Clara said suddenly, her voice trembling. "Not in the way people thought." Mrs. Whitfield's grip tightened on her arm. "That is quite enough." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Unkindness can take many forms," she said. "Sometimes it is merely impatience. Sometimes it is memory." Clara flinched. Mrs. Whitfield drew her daughter away, offering Miss Marple a tight smile that contained neither warmth nor gratitude. "Good night." "Good night," Miss Marple replied softly. She walked home alone, her mind turning carefully over the evening's events. The bitter almond scent suggested cyanide, a poison swift and dramatic, but not easily obtained without planning. The burned paper implied urgency, and the missing envelope from the fete table spoke of someone keenly aware of appearances. The word fragment, wren, continued to trouble her. At home, she removed her hat and gloves with habitual neatness, then seated herself by the small writing desk near the window. She did not light the brighter lamp, preferring the softer glow. It allowed thoughts to gather without scattering. Wren. St. Renford, certainly. But also, she rose and crossed to her bookshelf, selecting a slim volume of parish records she had borrowed months earlier under the pretext of genealogical curiosity. She turned pages slowly, her finger tracing old ink. There it was. Renford Mill, established 1872. Once owned by the Renford family before its decline and sale. The name had been shortened over time. Few now remembered the connection. Miss Marple's lips pursed faintly. If Edmund Fallow had invested in the mill, he would have uncovered its history. And if he had asked Clara whether people truly forget. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Reverend Collingwood, hat in hand, his face pale in the lamplight. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. Well, I felt rather unsettled, and you have a way of steadying matters." Miss Marple gestured him inside. He perched on the edge of a chair. "Do you think the letter was written by someone in the village?" "Almost certainly," she replied, "but to threaten everyone." "Was it everyone?" she asked quietly. He blinked. "It was addressed to the residents." "Yes, but addressed publicly. That is quite different from intended privately." The Reverend frowned, trying to follow. "Suppose," Miss Marple continued gently, "that the letter was meant to alarm one person in particular. Reading it aloud merely ensured that person could not ignore it." "Mr. Fallow," he breathed. "Perhaps." Reverend Collingwood hesitated. "Inspector Slack believes the burned paper may have been another letter." "Or a reply," Miss Marple suggested. He stared at her. "Don't imagine," she went on, "that Mr. Fallow received something earlier. Something that explained the grievance hinted at in the fate letter. Something he wished destroyed before it was discovered. And he was poisoned before he could finish. Or after," Miss Marple said mildly. "Poison allows a murderer to remain at a comfortable distance." The Reverend shuddered. Outside, a faint wind stirred the hedges, brushing them together with a sound like hushed voices conspiring. "Do you know who did it?" he asked at last. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the parish book still open on her desk. "I know," she said slowly, "that villages have long memories, even when their residents pretend otherwise. Old ownership, old grievances, old humiliations." She closed the book gently. "And I know," she added, "that when someone burns a name, they rarely consider how stubbornly the first letters cling to the page." The Reverend rose to leave, not entirely comforted but steadier than before. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair. Her thoughts moved now toward the Prices, toward the mill, toward Clara's frightened insistence that Edmund Fallow had not been kind, and toward Mrs. Whitfield's sharp interruption. The past is not buried. It waits. In St. Renford, it seemed, it had been waiting quite patiently indeed. Morning in St. Renford arrived with deceptive brightness. Sunlight touched the hedgerows, glinted on dew, and gave no outward sign that a man had died only hours before. Yet the village moved differently. Doors opened cautiously. Conversations were conducted in lowered tones. Even the postman rode more slowly, as though wary of delivering further calamity. Inspector Slack established himself at the small room adjoining the constable's office and began formal questioning shortly after 9. Word of it spread quickly, and those summoned arrived with expressions carefully arranged. Some affronted, some injured, some determinedly helpful. Miss Marple, not yet summoned, chose instead to walk toward the mill. The path there ran alongside a narrow stream that once powered its wheels. The building stood squat and sturdy, its brickwork darkened by age. Smoke did not rise from its chimney this morning. Work had been suspended after the previous evening's news. A cluster of workers lingered outside, uncertain whether to disperse or remain available for whatever future awaited them. Thomas Price emerged from the side entrance. His sleeves rolled despite the early hour. He looked tired, and more than tired, harried as though beset by pressures invisible to others. "Good morning, Mr. Price," Miss Marple said pleasantly. He started slightly. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect—" "No one expects these things," she replied gently. "It is rather the nature of them." He forced a thin smile. "If you're here about Mr. Fallow—" "I am always interested in village matters," she said. "And the mill has such a long history. It belonged once to the Renford family, did it not?" His expression shifted, just briefly, but unmistakably. "That was generations ago." "Of course. Names fade so easily. And yet they do linger." He wiped his hands on a cloth, buying time. "The inspectors already asked about the investment. Mr. Fallow wished to modernize operations. So there were disagreements. But that's business, not murder." "Business," Miss Marple echoed softly, "is often more personal than one imagines." His gaze hardened. "Are you suggesting I killed him?" "I suggest nothing," she said, smiling. "I merely observe that when livelihoods are threatened, emotions run high." He exhaled sharply. "We would have managed. There were other options." "Such as?" He hesitated again. "Alternative financing. A buyer, perhaps." "From outside the village?" "Yes." "And would that have pleased Mr. Fallow?" Thomas's jaw tightened. He would not have approved. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though noting a stitch in a complicated pattern. "Did Mr. Fallow ever mention the mill's original ownership to you?" she asked. He frowned. Why would he? Curiosity, perhaps. As investors are sometimes thorough. Thomas shook his head. He cared about profit, not heritage. Miss Marple let that pass. She thanked him and continued along the path, her thoughts turning. If Edmund Fallow had uncovered something in the mill's past, something connected to the name Wren, it might explain the burned fragment. Wren could refer not merely to the village, but to a family once tied to its livelihood. By mid-morning, the village had assembled itself into small pockets of speculation. At the tea shop, Mrs. Price held court with exaggerated composure, recounting the previous evening in careful fragments that placed her and her husband firmly within respectable boundaries. Colonel Armitage spoke tersely with the butcher, dismissing wild theories with military impatience. Clara Whitfield walked briskly toward the vicarage, her face pale but resolute. Inspector Slack's summons reached Miss Marple shortly before noon. She entered the small office to find him seated behind a desk strewn with notes. The charred fragment lay enclosed in a small envelope. He gestured her to a chair. "You've been asking questions," he said without preamble. "One always does," she replied mildly. He studied her. "You mentioned the past. What exactly did you mean?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Villages remember insults far longer than cities do. A slight to a family name, a broken engagement, a bankruptcy. Such things leave marks." "And you think this concerns a family?" "I think," she said carefully, "that the word fragment you recovered may not refer to the village at all." He leaned forward. "Go on." "There was once a Renford family who owned the mill. The name shortened over time, but records remain." Slack's eyes sharpened. And if Mr. Fallow examined the mill's history during his investment, he may have discovered something inconvenient. "Inconvenient how?" She gave a small shrug. "Ownership disputes, debts, agreements improperly settled. I cannot say without seeing the documents." Slack tapped his pencil against the desk. "You believe he received a letter connected to that history, burned it, and was poisoned to ensure silence?" "It is possible," she said. "By whom?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That depends who feared what he knew." He regarded her for a long moment. "You're suggesting motive tied to heritage rather than immediate grievance." "Immediate grievances are often masks," she replied. "Heritage carries pride. Pride carries shame." He nodded slowly. "The Whitfields," he said. "Their family's been here longer than most." "Indeed." And Clara seemed disturbed. "You noticed that as well." Slack leaned back. "I've spoken with Mrs. Whitfield this morning. She insists her family has no connection to the mill beyond community interest, but she was defensive." "Defensiveness," Miss Marple observed gently, "is rarely spontaneous." A constable knocked and entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "From Mr. Fallow's solicitor in Market Basing, sir. Delivered just now." Slack tore it open. Inside lay a slim folder of documents and a brief note indicating that these were copies of recent correspondence concerning property evaluations. He opened the folder and began scanning the top page. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Well," he muttered, and Miss Marple waited patiently. "The evaluation includes historical claims attached to the mill's original transfer," he said. "There's a clause here, never executed, regarding restitution to the Renford heirs." Miss Marple's gaze rested lightly on the page. "And are there," she asked softly, "any heirs remaining in St. Renford?" Slack looked up at her, the implications settling. "Yes," he said slowly, "there are." Evening gathered quietly over St. Renford, as though the village itself wished to witness what would follow. Inspector Slack had agreed, reluctantly but with growing respect, to Miss Marple's suggestion that the remaining principals be invited to Hawthorne Lodge once more. Mrs. Dalrymple, pale yet resolute, consented to host what she described as a final clarification, though her voice trembled on the word. As they assembled in the drawing-room where only 2 nights before polite applause had followed sponge cake and string music. Now the curtains were drawn against the fading light. A small fire burned, not for warmth, but for atmosphere. The chairs had been arranged in a loose semicircle. No one remarked upon the absence at its center. Thomas and Mrs. Price sat close together. Colonel Armitage stood rather than sit, arms folded. Reverend Collingwood clasped his hands tightly in his lap. Clara Whitfield sat beside her mother, her posture rigid. Mrs. Whitfield's expression was composed to the point of severity. Inspector Slack remained near the mantelpiece, outwardly in charge, though he had ceded the floor. Miss Marple rose gently, her knitting set aside. "My dear friends," she began softly, I fear that our pleasant village fete revealed rather more than bunting and sponge cake. No one smiled. The letter, she continued, was theatrical, certainly. But it was also precise. It did not threaten violence at random. It promised that one among you shall pay for what was done. That phrasing is important. It implies an old injury, not a sudden quarrel. Her gaze moved lightly across the room. Inspector Slack has confirmed that Edmund Fallow, in the course of reviewing the mill's financial standing, uncovered an unfulfilled clause. Many years ago, when the Renford family lost ownership of the mill, an agreement was drafted promising restitution to any surviving heirs should certain profits be realized. Thomas shifted. Mrs. Price tightened her lips. The clause was never executed, Miss Marple said. But it remained legally binding. Mrs. Whitfield's hand closed imperceptibly around Clara's. Mr. Fallow, Miss Marple went on, was not merely modernizing the mill, he was verifying its titles, and in doing so, he traced the lineage of the Renford family. A stillness fell, deep and absolute. The name shortened over time, Miss Marple said gently. Renford became simply Wren in certain parish records, and through marriage, that name passed into another. She turned her eyes at last toward Mrs. Whitfield. Your maiden name, I believe, was Wren. A sound escaped Clara before she could stop it. Mrs. Whitfield's composure did not shatter, but it cracked. That is ancient history, she said coldly. Irrelevant. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied. It is entirely relevant, as you are the last surviving heir referenced in that dormant clause. Mr. Fallow's review would have uncovered that fact. He would have realized that, should the mill return to significant profitability, restitution might be owed. Thomas stared at Mrs. Whitfield in astonishment. You never said. It was nothing, she snapped. A family embarrassment. We lost everything. There was no dignity left to salvage. And yet dignity, Miss Marple said quietly, is often the most fiercely guarded possession. Inspector Slack stepped forward slightly but did not interrupt. You see, Miss Marple continued, Mr. Fallow did not intend to honor the clause. He intended to eliminate it. Quietly. Permanently. His burned document was not a threat from someone else. It was a draft of a legal maneuver to void the restitution agreement entirely. Slack nodded once. The solicitor's correspondence had confirmed as much. He summoned you privately, Mrs. Whitfield, Miss Marple said. He asked whether people truly forget. You understood then that he knew. Clara turned to her mother, horror dawning. You told me he was only asking about village history. Mrs. Whitfield's face tightened. He meant to humiliate us again, to erase even the acknowledgement of what was owed. We endured poverty while others prospered, and now he would deny that injustice ever existed. So you wrote the letter, Slack said quietly. To frighten him, she replied sharply. To remind him he could not act unseen. The public reading ensured he could not dismiss it as private nonsense, Miss Marple added. It cornered him. Mrs. Whitfield's eyes flashed. He deserved to feel cornered. But when he burned the draft, Miss Marple continued, you realized he would proceed regardless. You visited him that evening under the pretense of negotiation. He trusted you enough to admit you. You carried with you something more persuasive than words. Clara shook her head, tears forming. Mother, the bitter almond scent, Miss Marple said softly, was unmistakable. Cyanide may be swift, but it is not silent. He collapsed before he could complete the burning. You left the blank sheet on his desk to suggest an interrupted note, and you removed the fate envelope from Hawthorne Lodge, believing it might link back to you. Mrs. Whitfield's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in exhausted release. I would not let him erase us, she whispered. We were not nothing. No, Miss Marple said gently. You were not. But murder does not restore dignity. It merely multiplies loss. Clara covered her face. Inspector Slack stepped forward now, his tone firm but not unkind. "Mrs. Whitfield, I must ask you to come with me." She rose with brittle composure. As she passed her daughter, she paused, but did not reach out. Whatever she might have said remained unspoken. The door closed behind them with a quiet finality. Silence lingered in the drawing room long after. Reverend Collingwood cleared his throat faintly. Colonel Armitage exhaled as though released from parade rest. Thomas Price looked as if the ground beneath the mill had shifted irreparably. Miss Marple retrieved her knitting. "It is always sad," she said softly, "when pride and injury ferment unchecked. Villagers remember, yes, but they must also forgive. Otherwise the past grows heavy enough to demand payment." Outside, the evening settled once more over St. Renford. The mill would continue, the stream would run, the roses would bloom with punctual obedience. But somewhere beneath the quiet hedges, the village understood that shadows, once stirred, did not entirely vanish. They merely learned to lie still again. And Miss Marple, serene and observant as ever, resumed her gentle clicking of needles. Another pattern completed, though never celebrated.